My name is Harold Whitmore. I turned 82 last October. For the past 47 years, I've lived in the same colonial-style house at the edge of a quiet historic district in New Haven, Connecticut. The house is more than 2 centuries old, though you'd never guess it from the way I've kept it up. My late wife, Eleanor, used to say that the house would outlive us all, and maybe she was right. The shutters are freshly painted, the brickwork is intact, and the porch creaks only slightly in the rain. I don't get many visitors anymore, not since Eleanor passed and our son, Justin, moved to Boston and stopped finding reasons to come back. That's fine. I don't need much company. I have my books, my morning paper, my silence, and my collection. It started small, the collection. A single flintlock pistol from the Revolutionary War, gifted to me by my uncle when I was 12. I remember holding it in my hands, feeling its weight, its gravity, not just of metal, but of history. Over the decades, I acquired more. Pocket watches, powder horns, Civil War canteens, 18th century writing desks, heirloom rifles. Each item has its own story. I kept detailed records, wrote provenance histories, made notes on every scratch and restoration. When Eleanor was alive, she tolerated it, even humored me. Your dusty little army, she called it. But she knew it wasn't about war. It was about memory, preservation, time. This collection is the only legacy I truly care about. Not because of what it's worth, but because it reflects everything I've ever cherished. Patience, continuity, and a kind of reverence for lives long gone. Eleanor died 8 years ago. Stroke. One moment she was humming in the kitchen, the next she was on the floor, her fingers twitching toward me like she was trying to say something. I called the ambulance, waited with her, held her hand. She didn't make it to the hospital. After her funeral, Justin stayed for exactly 1 night. He brought his fiancée, stayed in the guest room, and by morning they were gone. I never quite forgave him for the speed with which he vanished. No lingering over coffee. No questions about how I was holding up. Just an awkward handshake and the hollow promise, "We'll be back soon, Dad." They weren't. Over the years, his calls became infrequent, always laced with apology and stress. He works in finance, something to do with real estate and acquisitions. I never really understood what, and he never explained it. All I knew was that he had money problems. Strange for a man who wore designer watches and drove an imported SUV. He came around once a year, maybe twice if there was some family obligation he couldn't dodge. He'd glance around the living room, ask about all the stuff, and then quickly change the subject. A few times I caught him lingering over a particular musket or opening a drawer of ivory-handled letter openers like he was cataloging them in his head. Still, I didn't think much of it. Maybe I should have. Maybe I should have paid more attention to the way he always asked about my will, about the house, about whether I had plans for the collection. Each time I brushed him off with the same answer. "It's not going anywhere until I do." He would laugh, a shallow chuckle that didn't reach his eyes. Then he'd go silent. I live alone now, if you can call it living. I make breakfast at 6, sit in the sunroom, and read the paper from front to back. I watch birds. I water the same begonias Eleanor planted 2 decades ago, because if I don't, no one will. At night, I wind the grandfather clock and check every room before locking up. Not because I expect intruders, just because it's what I've always done. That, and habit, is the last thing to go. Sometimes I think about what will happen to all this when I'm gone. The house, the antiques, the journals, the photographs, the letters I never sent. I had once thought Justin would care, would come to see their value not in dollars but in meaning. I kept believing that even as the visits got shorter, the calls more strained. I told myself he was busy, that city life consumed him. I told myself he would come around. But lately, there's been a change. It started when he showed up unannounced one Sunday afternoon, something he hadn't done in more than 5 years, Said he was in town for a conference. Thought he'd stop by. I made coffee. We sat in the parlor, and he looked around with more interest than usual. He asked specific questions. When I'd acquired the Chippendale cabinet, whether the naval sextant in the study was authentic, how much I'd paid for the Queen Anne writing desk. It felt less like curiosity and more like an appraisal. I mentioned that I wasn't looking to sell anything. He nodded too quickly. That night I sat in my chair long after he left, watching the shadows stretch across the hardwood floors. Something didn't sit right. I couldn't put my finger on it. Just a sense, an unease, like some thread had come loose and I didn't know which one. Weeks passed. I got a letter from a regional historical society thanking me for expressing interest in donating several key items. The letter mentioned specific pieces: my 1764 grandfather clock, the Lafayette saber, a rare porcelain snuff box with the initials, GW. I hadn't contacted them. I called to clarify, and they said they'd been in communication with someone claiming to act on my behalf. My name had been used, my phone number provided, but the email address wasn't mine. I asked them to send me a copy of the correspondence. When it arrived, I saw the name at the bottom, Justin W. Whitmore. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat in my armchair in the dark, the envelope clutched in my hand. A chill had settled over the house, and it wasn't from the drafty windows. I felt as if I were being written out of my own life. At first I considered confronting him, calling him, demanding an explanation, but something told me not to. Something told me to wait, to see how far he would go. That's when I began checking the locks more carefully, double-checking the inventory I kept in a leather-bound book Eleanor had given me decades ago. Some pieces had been moved. Others had slight smudges I didn't remember leaving. I began sleeping in shorter bursts, light and alert. A man gets used to silence after years of it, but not to the sense of being watched. Then, one Tuesday morning, I received a glossy catalog in the mail from a well-known New England auction house. I almost threw it away, thinking it was junk mail, but the cover caught my eye. Fall Americana sale, featuring rare 18th and 19th century private collection. I flipped it open. There, on page 11, was my tall case clock. Page 15, my revolutionary powder horn. Page 23, my great-grandfather's campaign chest, listed with the phrase, "From a long-standing private collector in New Haven." The date of the auction was 2 weeks away. That was when I knew. Justin hadn't just taken inventory. He hadn't just asked around. He had taken my collection, piece by piece, and consigned it without my knowledge, behind my back, without my consent. He thought I was too old, too slow to notice. He thought he could do it quietly, and I'd never find out until it was done. But he was wrong. I was very much alive, and I would be at that auction, standing in the room, waiting for the moment they tried to sell what was mine. I didn't go to the auction house right away. I waited 3 full days. I wanted to be deliberate, calm. I didn't want to walk in there shouting like some confused old man no one would take seriously. Instead, I spent that time reviewing every item in the catalog, cross-referencing them with my records. Page by page, I circled what was mine. Out of the 67 items listed in the Whitmore collection, 48 of them were indisputably from my house, not just similar. The exact ones. My penknife carvings were still visible on the walnut base of the hall stand. The ink stain from Eleanor's hand still marked the corner of the mahogany desk where she once wrote a birthday letter to my father. The markings weren't just physical. They were etched into memory, into time. These things were not for sale, not at any price, and certainly not by someone who had no right to touch them. When I finally did go, I wore my old herringbone coat, the one Eleanor liked because it made me look distinguished, not old. I took the city bus instead of driving. I wanted time to think. The auction house was located in a gentrified part of New Haven, repurposed red brick buildings, sleek signage, overpriced cafes. The sign over the door read Lanscombe and Gray, historic estates and fine collectibles. I walked in and was greeted by a young man in a navy blazer who couldn't have been more than 25. His teeth were too white, his handshake too soft. I introduced myself simply, Harold Whitmore. I believe you're hosting a sale that involves some of my possessions. He blinked twice, clearly unprepared for that sentence. He offered me a brochure, but I waved it away. I already had it memorized. I told him I'd like to view the pieces listed as from the private New Haven collection. He hesitated, clearly torn between protocol and the sudden presence of a potential legal complication. Eventually, he led me to a side gallery where the items were displayed under soft lighting, behind polished glass, each tagged with numbers and exaggerated provenance blurbs. And there they were. My things. I moved slowly through the room, as if walking through a funeral parlor. My great-uncle's field compass. The clock that sat in our hallway for 40 years, its chime dulled from wear. A tintype photograph of Eleanor's great-grandparents, still in the silver frame she found at a flea market when we were first married. All of it arranged like museum pieces, silent and severed from their meaning. I stopped in front of the campaign chest, the one my great-grandfather had taken to war, the one he'd dragged through mud and gunfire, the one I polished every year on Memorial Day. I stood there for a long time, hands behind my back, heart pounding in a way I hadn't felt since Eleanor's funeral. These were not just things. These were my life, reduced to inventory numbers and lot estimates. The gallery attendant hovered nervously at a distance, watching me as though I might throw a tantrum or collapse. I didn't do either. Instead, I asked one simple question. Who consigned these items? He shifted on his feet, mumbled something about confidentiality. I told him I wasn't asking for the name. I already knew the name. I wanted to know the paperwork. What documents had been provided to prove ownership? He offered to get a manager. The manager turned out to be a woman named Shelley Brandt, mid-40s, no nonsense, but not unkind. She met me in a private office, clean white walls, track lighting, a framed print of the Boston Tea Party over the desk. I repeated my question. She, too, cited confidentiality, but when I told her I was Harold Whitmore, the man whose name was literally printed in their catalog, her tone shifted. She asked me to wait while she checked the file. I sat perfectly still, listening to the buzz of the overhead light and the faint tapping of someone typing at reception. When she returned, she had a manila folder in her hand. The consignment was submitted by Justin Whitmore, she said, opening the folder. He provided a notarized statement confirming that he had been granted authority to handle the estate assets on your behalf. My blood turned cold. Estate? I asked. I'm not dead. She looked up, startled. I'm aware of that now. I asked to see the statement. She hesitated, but then slid it across the desk. I recognized the notary's seal, a small office downtown I hadn't visited in years. The signature at the bottom bore my name, but I hadn't signed it. I held it closer, tracing the strokes. It was good, very good. Whoever had done it had taken their time. But it wasn't mine. The R in Harold curved wrong. The loop in the H was missing. It was a forgery. Miss Brandt, I said carefully, this is a fraudulent document. I never gave my son or anyone else the right to sell anything from my home. These items were never removed with my knowledge or consent. I am the legal owner, and I want them returned immediately. She paled. Mr. Whitmore, this is very serious. I nodded. Yes, it is. She asked if I would be willing to file a formal dispute. I told her I'd already contacted a lawyer, which I hadn't. Not yet. But I would before sundown. She said the auction would be frozen until the matter could be investigated. I thanked her, took the file with me, and walked out of that place with my heart hammering in my chest. Back on the street, The sky had clouded over. I stood at the bus stop feeling like I had stepped into someone else's life. How had it come to this? How had my own son not only stolen from me but declared me legally absent? A ghost whose estate could be liquidated like furniture after a funeral. I felt humiliated. But more than that, I felt dangerous. Because I was not the fragile old man he had counted on. I was not confused. I was not gone. I was standing right there. And now I would make sure he knew it. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen table with the manila folder open, rereading the fake affidavit Justin had submitted, trying to understand not only how he had pulled this off, but how far he was willing to go to erase me from the picture. The fact that he'd used my name to represent an estate implied something chilling. Not just that he believed I was irrelevant, but that he was attempting to create a paper trail of my disappearance, slowly constructing a version of events in which I was no longer present, no longer involved, no longer alive. That kind of act isn't just reckless, it's strategic. He wasn't stealing. He was rewriting reality. I spent the early hours of the morning going through every drawer, cabinet, and closet in the house, compiling a complete list of missing items. I found evidence of subtle, careful theft. Small, empty spaces where display cases had been moved back slightly, faint dust outlines that no longer matched the objects that had once rested there. He hadn't taken everything at once. He'd been doing this gradually, quietly, maybe for months. Every time he stopped by, every time he asked to borrow a key to check on something, he had been removing my legacy piece by piece, like termites hollowing out the beams of a house no one thought to inspect. By the time dawn filtered through the kitchen windows, I had a list of 49 items that were either listed in the auction or clearly missing from my home. I made photocopies of my handwritten inventories, digital photos from my collection logs, and printouts of purchase records, all of which I kept meticulously in the back room, in a filing cabinet Justin probably didn't even know existed. I dressed, combed my hair, and walked the mile to the law offices of Hammond and Rook, a modest firm near the Green that had helped Eleanor and me with our will 20 years earlier. The receptionist, a soft-spoken woman in her 60s named Louise, recognized me immediately and said Mr. Rook would see me. When I entered his office, I placed the manila folder and my binder of evidence on his desk without a word. I didn't start from the beginning. I started with the auction. I showed him the catalog. I showed him the signed affidavit. I showed him my inventory and the discrepancy list. And then, only after all the facts were laid bare, did I finally say the words I had been choking on since yesterday. My son is trying to sell my collection, as if I were dead. Mr. Rook leaned back in his chair, silent for a moment. Then he leaned forward again and said something that surprised me. You're not the first client this month to come in with something like this. It's becoming more common than you'd think. Children assuming control of assets while the parent is still alive, under the guise of helping or managing things. But this, he gestured at the folder, this is deliberate fraud. He made copies of everything, promised to file a cease and desist to halt the sale, and said he would notify the auction house formally within the hour. I left his office with a sense of grim satisfaction, but it was short-lived. When I returned home, I found the front door unlocked. Not broken, not forced, just ajar, as if whoever had been inside wanted me to know they'd been there. I entered carefully, heart pounding, every muscle tense with suspicion. Nothing seemed overtly disturbed at first, but the feeling in the air was wrong, as though the house had been exhaled and not yet drawn breath again. I checked every room, every drawer. In my bedroom, the top drawer of my dresser had been opened and left that way. I kept nothing of value there, just old handkerchiefs and cufflinks. But someone had been looking for something. In the study, my filing cabinet was open, papers shuffled, and the small fireproof safe under the desk, where I kept my birth certificate, my will, and Eleanor's wedding ring, had been tampered with. It was locked, but the latch showed signs of forced contact. I checked the contents. Nothing missing. But the message was clear. I was being watched. Or worse, someone was trying to get ahead of whatever legal response I was mounting. That evening, I called Justin. For the first time in months, he picked up on the first ring. His voice was upbeat, almost smug. "Dad! Hey, how's it going?" I said nothing for a long moment. Then I asked, evenly, "Did you really think I wouldn't find out?" There was a pause. Not long, but enough to confirm what I already knew. He knew exactly what I meant. His tone shifted. "Dad, listen. I was going to talk to you about that." There was some confusion. "I thought you were dead," I snapped. "You thought I was dead." He tried to laugh it off. No. Come on, it's just, there was a misunderstanding. The auction house needed provenance. I just streamlined the paperwork." "Streamlined?" I asked, incredulous. "You forged my signature, you broke into my house, you removed historical property I've spent my life protecting, and you call it streamlined?" He got defensive. Okay, look. Maybe I handled it wrong. But you never made it clear what you wanted done with all that stuff. I mean, it's just sitting there gathering dust. Don't you want someone to appreciate it?" I felt something inside me harden. "Appreciate it? Like a vulture appreciates a corpse?" He sighed. "This is exactly why I didn't tell you. You get so emotional about this collection. It's just stuff, Dad. You can't take it with you." That line. That cold, cliched line hit me like a slap. I didn't answer. I hung up the phone. The next day, I called Mr. Rook again and told him to initiate formal action, not just against the auction house but against my own son. Restraining order, theft charges, whatever the law allowed. I was done playing the part of the passive father. Justin had crossed a line, and now he would learn that his aging father still had more resolve in him than he ever gave me credit for. The following week was a blur of legal filings, notarized statements, affidavits, and correspondence with the auction house. Shelley Brandt called me personally to apologize, said all items had been pulled from the catalog pending investigation, and offered assistance in returning anything already transferred to their facility. I told her to send everything back, every crate, every item, even the ones I hadn't officially listed, because if Justin had touched one thing, he had touched more. The deliveries arrived in stages. One truck, then another. I checked every box, unpacked every item with trembling hands, making sure no damage had occurred. Some frames were scratched. One clock had a cracked glass face. I documented it all, but mostly the pieces were intact. Physically. Their meaning, though, had changed. No longer just family heirlooms, they were now evidence. Symbols of betrayal. Artifacts not only of history, but of how far a son can fall from the values of his father. But the worst came last. Inside one crate marked miscellaneous, unlisted, I found Eleanor's journal. It hadn't been in the public display room. It hadn't been listed in the catalog, which meant Justin hadn't planned to sell it. He'd planned to keep it. For what? I couldn't imagine. Maybe sentiment, maybe leverage. But opening that leather-bound book, feeling the familiar pages beneath my hands, was the closest I'd come to weeping in years. I sat in the study for hours, turning pages, reading Eleanor's handwriting. Her thoughts, her private hopes, her notes about our early years. I came across a line, dated March 22nd, 1981. Justin worries me sometimes. He's too eager for more, always more. I fear we're not teaching him gratitude. I closed the book. My wife had seen it coming decades before I ever could. I placed the journal back in the safe, locked it, and sat back in my chair. The house was silent again, but no longer peaceful. The war hadn't yet begun, but the drums were beating. And when the time came, I would meet my son on whatever battlefield he chose. Because this time, I was ready. The letter came on a Thursday, just before noon, tucked between a utility bill and a grocery flyer, in a clean white envelope with a return address I didn't recognize. Inside was a single sheet, printed on high-quality paper, headed in bold type. Petition for protective conservatorship. My breath caught as I read the words, my fingers trembling. The petitioner, Justin Whitmore. The subject, Harold Whitmore. In simple terms, my own son was petitioning the court to have me declared mentally incompetent. His claim was that I was no longer capable of managing my affairs, and therefore he sought full authority over my estate, my property, and my medical decisions. It was stunning not just in its cruelty, but in its audacity. I stared at the page for what felt like an hour, rereading phrases that felt pulled from some alternate version of my life. Increasing cognitive decline, paranoid fixation on household objects, irrational hostility toward immediate family. There were even references to episodes of confusion, unverified, unproven, and entirely fabricated. I placed the letter on the table and sat down in Eleanor's old rocking chair. My heart pounded, not out of fear but out of cold, bracing rage. This was not a mistake. This was not a misunderstanding. This was war. He was trying to erase me from my own life with a pen and a court order. I had expected theft, deception, maybe even lies to my face. But this went further. This was character assassination. This was premeditated exile. I picked up the phone and called Mr. Rook, who answered on the second ring. "We were expecting this," he said calmly after I read the first paragraph aloud. "It's his only move left. You stopped the auction, you established ownership, and now he's trying to flip the narrative. Make it seem like you're the problem." I asked him what my options were. "You'll need to undergo a psychological evaluation," he said, "voluntarily through an independent clinic. If we can get a clean report from a certified neurologist and a psychiatrist, we can crush this in court. But Harold, this isn't just about documentation anymore. He's trying to humiliate you, to drag your name through the mud." I nodded, though he couldn't see it. "Then we'll give him nothing to drag." The next day, I began the process. I spent nearly 6 hours in 2 separate offices, taking cognitive assessments, memory tests, balance checks, even speaking to a gerontologist about my daily habits and routines. Every doctor I met was professional, courteous, and quietly apologetic. They knew why I was there. They knew how common these cases had become. Children trying to expedite the transfer of wealth by pretending that gray hair meant confusion, that grief looked like dementia, that solitude meant madness. But I was sharp. I answered their questions clearly, with detail, and when one of the clinicians asked me to recall a list of 10 random objects 20 minutes after hearing them, I rattled them off without hesitation. I hadn't made it to 82 by accident. I hadn't curated a 40-year archive of American history while being scatterbrained. I was not the man Justin described in his filing, and the reports proved it. 3 days later, Mr. Rook called to say the evaluations had come back clean. Better than clean. One of the doctors had noted, subject demonstrates exceptional mental clarity for his age, along with superior long-term memory and organizational faculties. I allowed myself a moment of quiet satisfaction. Then I asked the only question that mattered. "When do we go to court?" The hearing was scheduled for the following week. Justin was notified. He didn't call. He didn't show up. Instead, he sent a lawyer, a young, nervous man named Clay who shuffled papers and looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. The judge, a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s named Marion Coyle, read through the documents carefully. Mr. Rook submitted the medical evaluations. He presented the evidence of the forged affidavit. He spoke with calm precision, laying out the timeline of the consignment, the auction, and the fraudulent conservatorship claim. When Clay tried to argue that Justin had acted in the spirit of concern, Judge Coyle stopped him mid-sentence. "Concern does not excuse forgery," she said flatly. Concern does not explain preemptive removal of property, nor does it validate filing court paperwork that misrepresents the subject's living condition and mental status. If Mr. Whitmore truly believed his father was in distress, he should have visited, not stolen from him. Clay mumbled something inaudible. Judge Coyle turned to me. "Mr. Whitmore, is there anything you wish to say?" I stood slowly and met her eyes. "Your Honor," I said, "I buried my wife 8 years ago. I've lived alone since then. I cook my meals, I read history, I take care of the home she and I built together. I know who I am, I know what I own, and I know what it means to be betrayed by the only family I have left. What I don't know is how a son looks at his father and sees opportunity instead of legacy." She nodded once. Then she ruled. The petition was denied. The court recognized the continued capacity and autonomy of Harold Whitmore. The fraud was noted on the record. No further actions could be taken by the petitioner without full court supervision. I thanked her. I shook Mr. Rook's hand, and as I stepped outside the courthouse into the cold afternoon sun, I realized the tide had turned. I wasn't just defending myself anymore. I was moving forward. In the weeks following the court hearing, the silence from Justin was deafening, not just in its absence but in its shape, as though he were actively constructing that silence to signal something: disdain, rage, or perhaps the kind of quiet calculation a man turns to when open aggression has failed. I knew my victory in court would not be the end, only a shift in the battlefield. Justin wasn't done. His type never is. Men like him, restless, clever in all the wrong ways, don't retreat when faced with justice. They burrow, recalculate, and look for a weaker flank. I had won the first public clash, but I also understood that his humiliation before a judge wouldn't satisfy the gnawing greed that had driven him to this point. I began noticing things again, details I would have ignored before this war started. A car I didn't recognize parked across from my house 3 days in a row. Calls to my landline that rang once and hung up when I answered. The back gate, which I always kept bolted, found ajar 2 mornings in a row despite no signs of forced entry. These weren't coincidences. Justin, or someone acting on his behalf, was still watching, still trying to find leverage, still hoping to manufacture a version of events in which I would appear unstable, alone, paranoid. It was a grotesque inversion of gaslighting, one where the gas itself was real, the lights deliberately flickering, and all of it orchestrated to convince me and anyone watching that I was losing grip on reality. Then came the call from the insurance company. The representative was polite, far too polite. She said she was simply verifying the recent policy change requested by the estate of Harold Whitmore, in which my home, my collection, and my supplemental health coverage were all slated for cancellation. She said the cancellation request had come through an attorney representing my executor. I told her calmly that I was alive, not deceased, not incapacitated, and that no such executor existed. She apologized profusely and said she would escalate the issue. I thanked her, hung up, and sat in silence for nearly an hour, staring at nothing, my heart a hard knot in my chest. He was trying again. He hadn't even changed tactics, only angles. If he couldn't take my collection through the front door, and he couldn't erase me legally, then he would try to squeeze me administratively, cut off protections, block access to resources, and hope that enough bureaucratic confusion would bring me to my knees. It was elegant in its own way, this slow, paper-based erosion of a person's autonomy. Not a single lock broken, not a single word spoken, but death by signature. Mr. Rook confirmed my fears 2 days later. He discovered that Justin had filed several requests in multiple counties to have me placed under a safety review, a process that, if granted, would allow a temporary guardian to monitor my financial activity. It wasn't a conservatorship. It didn't need to be. All it required was a sympathetic social worker and a few allegations of erratic behavior. Mr. Rook reassured me that we were blocking each request as they came, but it was clear the war had entered a new phase, one that was quieter but more insidious. Meanwhile, my possessions, those that had not been boxed or damaged, sat restored in my home, but with a different energy now, less sacred, more embattled, as though they too had been violated, touched by hands that didn't understand their meaning. I couldn't look at my wife's portrait without remembering how her diary had been packed into a crate like it was a dusty relic. I couldn't wind the grandfather clock without thinking of how close it had come to being paraded in front of strangers for profit. Even my study, once a sanctuary, now felt invaded. So I began locking the doors inside my own house, not to keep anyone out, but to signal to myself that this was mine, still mine, and would remain so until I took my last breath. Then came the email, sent anonymously from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line read, "Thought you should know." Inside was a single link. I almost deleted it, but something made me click. It led to an online listing from a private auction network I'd never heard of before. Some exclusive site catering to discreet collectors. And there, in high resolution, was a photo of my Lafayette Sabre. Not a similar one. Mine. I recognized the chip in the ivory handle, the custom engraving I had commissioned after purchasing it in 1986. The listing stated that it was from a private New England estate, and that provenance was under legal review. The price was set at $48,000. I scrolled through the site and found more. A matched pair of dueling pistols. My wife's sterling silver tea set. Even the painting we had bought on our honeymoon in Vermont, an oil landscape by an unknown artist that only meant something to us. My blood boiled. These weren't just duplicate listings. These were items that hadn't even made it into the first auction, the pieces Justin had kept in reserve, maybe planning to sell later once the dust had settled. And now, despite everything, despite the court's ruling, he was trying again, this time in the shadows, hoping no one would trace it back to him. But he had made a mistake. One of the listings showed the corner of a hardwood floor in the background. My hardwood floor, the study's floor, with its distinctive pattern of age-darkened pine and the hairline split that ran between two boards near the window. He had taken the photos inside my house long before I discovered the theft, long before I had even known what was missing. That floor was unmistakable. That was evidence. I forwarded the email to Mr. Rook, who replied an hour later with a single line, "We have him." From there, things accelerated. A subpoena was issued to the website to identify the seller. A restraining order was filed. And finally, the police opened an investigation. Not into me, but into Justin. Fraud, unlawful sale of property, falsifying legal documents, identity misrepresentation, and potentially conspiracy to defraud an elder. I don't know if he ever expected to be arrested. I don't think people like Justin expect consequences. They live in a world of transactions, not morals, and they believe they're always one document ahead of punishment. When the officers came to his apartment in Boston, he refused to open the door. They had to call in a locksmith. Inside, they found printouts of my financial statements, blank notary forms, and photographs of my collection laid out like blueprints. The police inventory listed items of uncertain origin, a phrase that struck me with a kind of bitter poetry. Eleanor would have wept. Or maybe she wouldn't. Maybe she would have stood as I did, silent, grieving not the crime itself but the soul of the boy we raised, lost somewhere behind that polished smile and expensive cufflinks. The arrest made local news, just a brief mention on the evening segment, but I saw it. New Haven man defrauded by own son. That was the headline. I watched it from my living room, the TV glowing in the dark. The anchor moved on quickly to a story about a dog rescue, but I kept staring at the screen long after. There was no victory in it, just sorrow. In the following days, messages poured in. Neighbors, old friends, even distant relatives I hadn't heard from in years. Some offered condolences, others quiet support, and a few, disturbingly, wanted to know if I'd be selling any of the items after all, as if trauma turned inventory into opportunity. I ignored them. I spent most of my days organizing what remained, cataloging damage, restoring order. But something in me had changed. I no longer saw the collection as my refuge. It had become a battlefield, and I didn't want to live in a war zone anymore. So I made a decision. Not out of fear or bitterness, but out of clarity. I began reaching out to museums. Not to sell. To donate. One by one, I offered pieces to institutions that would preserve them, protect them, and display them with the respect they deserved. I drafted letters. I packed items myself. I watched the boxes leave my home like children going off to safer places. It hurt, but it healed something too. Because in giving them away, I was taking back what Justin had tried to steal. My will, my intent, my name. By the end of the month, half the collection was gone. Not stolen, not auctioned, but gifted, honored. And with every departure, the house grew quieter, lighter, less burdened by the echoes of betrayal. I was preparing for something, though I didn't yet know what. Not death. No, not yet. But something like peace. It happened on a Friday morning, early spring, the kind of day Eleanor would have called deceptive, when the sky is clean and blue, but the wind still cuts through your coat. I had just finished wrapping another parcel. A pair of colonial brass candlesticks destined for the Philadelphia Museum of American History, when there was a knock at the door, firm and unfamiliar. Through the peephole I saw a young woman, mid-30s, sharply dressed in a beige suit, holding a tablet and a leather folder. I opened the door cautiously, and before I could speak, she introduced herself as Ms. Adler from the Office of Adult Protective Services. I knew the name. I had seen it on one of the earlier threats Justin had submitted when he tried to initiate a review. She explained that although the previous petitions had been dismissed, a new complaint had come in from a concerned party, citing that I was allegedly disposing of property in a manner inconsistent with mental stability, and they were required to follow up. I asked who had made the complaint. She hesitated, then said that legally the name was confidential, but off the record I already knew. Justin, of course. Even now, even facing charges, even with the weight of the law pressing down on him, he was still maneuvering. I invited her inside, offered her tea, which she politely declined. She walked slowly through the front rooms, her eyes scanning the bare patches on the walls where paintings had once hung, the gaps in the shelves where rare volumes had stood, now neatly boxed and labeled for shipment. I explained everything, my decision to donate the collection, the documentation I had prepared, the inventory logs, the letters of acceptance from the museums. I showed her photographs of the crates being picked up by trusted couriers, receipts for every item. I showed her my financial records, unchanged except for standard banking activity. I showed her the court ruling that upheld my competence, the medical evaluations, even the letter from the judge herself. For a moment, she said nothing. She just looked at me, her expression neutral but no longer skeptical. Finally, she said, "To be honest, Mr. Whitmore, we rarely see cases this clear." She tapped her tablet, made a few notes, then looked up. "I'll be closing the review as unfounded. I'm sorry for the intrusion." I nodded, thanked her, and showed her to the door. But just before she left, she paused and said something I'll never forget. "You know, we don't often get to see the other side of these stories. We usually meet people too late. But you're fighting like hell to keep hold of something. That matters." And then she was gone. That afternoon I sat in the sunroom, where the light streamed in through the tall windows and the dust hung in the air like breath. I felt tired, but not weak. not broken. For months, I had been preparing for another ambush, another accusation, another document aimed like a dagger at my sanity. But with this visit, I realized the worst had passed. I had held the line. The attacks had come from every direction, legal, psychological, financial, and each time I had met them not with rage, but with resolve. And still there was something missing, something unresolved. Not with the law, not with the auction, but with him. Justin hadn't spoken to me since his arrest. His lawyer had entered a plea, denying most of the charges, claiming miscommunication between family members. The press had moved on, the story forgotten. But I hadn't forgotten. He was out on bail, still living in that high-rise apartment in Boston, still working whatever angles were left to him. But I wasn't finished. Not because I wanted revenge, though there were days I dreamed of shouting at him until my throat gave out, but because there was still a matter of truth to be spoken. And I didn't want to carry that silence to my grave. So I wrote him a letter, 3 pages, handwritten, steady, and clean. I didn't accuse, I didn't plead. I told the story of how Eleanor and I built this home, piece by piece, how the collection began. Not as an investment, but as a quiet act of devotion to memory. I reminded him of the nights we sat together in the study, him a boy of 8 or 9, asking questions about the Civil War belt buckle or the ivory inkwell, and how his eyes lit up when I told him each item's origin. I wrote about the dinner after Eleanor's funeral, the way he looked past me as if grief were a distraction. I wrote about the visit where he asked me about the value of the desk I kept Eleanor's letters in. I told him I remembered everything, his tone, his impatience masked as concern. I told him that he hadn't just stolen things. He'd stolen narrative. He'd taken the story of our family and tried to republish it under his name. And then, in the final paragraph, I said, "I forgive you, not because you deserve it, but because I need it. Because I will not let your failures define the last chapter of my life." Because Eleanor would have told me not to let bitterness rot the roots of what still blooms. I signed it, sealed it, and walked to the post office that same day. I never expected a reply. I didn't need one. The act of writing was enough. The next day, I opened the last crate. Inside was the Jefferson clock, a walnut timepiece from 1792, one of the earliest in my collection. For years it had been on the mantel in the parlor, ticking softly through holidays, quiet mornings, and thunderstorms. I lifted it out with both hands and carried it to the study, placing it gently back in its place. I wound it. I waited. The tick resumed, measured, calm, indifferent to what had happened around it. In that moment I understood something fundamental. He had tried to make me disappear, but I was still here, still ticking. It has now been 11 months since the day I opened that auction catalog and saw my legacy offered up like yard sale scraps. The house is quieter now, not because it is empty, but because it has settled. There's a difference between silence and stillness. Silence can be suffocating, but stillness is peace earned. Half the collection is gone, yes, but not lost. It lives now in climate-controlled archives behind museum glass, beneath carefully lettered plaques that explain where it came from and why it matters. Visitors read about it. Children point and ask questions. Historians trace the outlines of time across wood and metal that once stood in my study. That, to me, is as close to immortality as a man like me can hope for. Not in name, not in photograph, but in meaning. The other half remains here with me, not because I need to cling to it, but because I am its last steward. When I go, it too will go, not into the hands of those who would sell it, but into the care of those who understand what preservation means. I haven't heard from Justin since I mailed that letter. Not a call, not a card, not a note scribbled in bitterness. I read in the local paper that his trial is scheduled for the fall. The charges remain fraud, misrepresentation, attempted unlawful sale of protected property. His lawyer is likely negotiating. There was a line in the article quoting sources close to the case that said the defendant is under considerable financial stress. I suppose that's the shape of his remorse, not guilt, but inconvenience. I think sometimes about what kind of man he might have become if he had loved history instead of leverage, memory instead of margin. But then I remember the look in his eyes that last time we spoke, the hollow justifications, the cold line about how I couldn't take it with me. And I know the answer. He chose this. Whatever childhood fractures formed the crack in him, whatever emptiness he carries, he filled it not with truth but with transaction. And a man like that cannot be reached until he chooses to be. People sometimes ask if I regret not having more children. I don't. Eleanor and I made a life together, and from that life came one child, and that child made choices. I gave him everything I knew how to give: patience, guidance, stability. What he did with it was never mine to control. What was mine was the keeping of our past, the stewardship of a home and a narrative built not on wealth, but on meaning. And in the end, that's what I defended. Not furniture, not brass or lacquer or old flags, but the principle that some things are not for sale. Not at any price, not under any pressure, not even when the buyer wears your name. These days, I rise early and tend to the house like I always have. I still read the paper in the sunroom, though I no longer look at the financial section. I make my own breakfast, slow but deliberate. I listen to music on vinyl, mostly jazz, sometimes old radio broadcasts Eleanor recorded on cassette back when we still had a stereo system. I receive letters from curators thanking me for what I've shared. One museum even invited me to speak, but I declined, not out of pride. I just think some stories are better left in the hands of those who ask for them, not those who perform them. The neighbors wave more now. I think the story made its way around town in quiet circles. No one says much, but there's a different quality to the way they look at me, as if they understand in some unspoken way that I've endured something more intimate than loss. I've endured erasure and refused it. And perhaps in this world that's become a kind of heroism. Staying, remaining, standing still while others try to sell your life from beneath your feet. As I write this, the Jefferson clock ticks behind me. It has not lost a beat since I wound it that day. Its sound is no longer merely mechanical. It is a pulse, a reminder. Not just that time moves forward, but that I am still here, and while I am, nothing will be taken without a fight. And when I will go knowing that I named what mattered. I protected it, and I gave it a place to rest beyond the reach of those who would call it dust.